world?
When I'll give an example. When the U.S. put on sanctions on Russia in March 2022, just after the beginning of this latest phase of the war that started in 2014, I know senior U.S. financial officials, and we've got them. This is going to crush them. I said, I don't think so. I was in Latin America last week. They're not going to do this. I was in India the week before that. It's not going to go like that. So what happened was the only ones that applied the sanctions are Europe, the United States, and a few allies in East Asia, Japan, Korea, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore. The rest of the world said, we're not part of that. We don't sign up to this. We don't like this. We don't agree with the NATO enlargement. We don't like this narrative. And the sanctions proved to be, pretty useless compared to what this grandiosity of the U.S. strategists thought. So it comes to this question, what does the rest of the world think? The rest of the world doesn't think much of the United States, what it's doing. It seems to them is a bizarre country. Why are you pushing NATO enlargement? Why are you bringing us into your war? We don't really want this. Interestingly, most of the rest of the world is not against the United States, by the way. They said, just don't make us choose all these things. This isn't our battle, and we don't even like what you're doing. Just make peace, calm things down. And we don't want bad relations, so it's not as if the world's antagonistic. But Washington does not get this at all. I probably speak to I speak to a lot of world leaders in developing countries all the time. It's my job as a development economist. So I'm talking to world leaders, foreign ministers, heads of state, and so on. And I know their understanding and position very clearly. I don't know whether the White House or Blinken or anyone else in the administration understands even these basic points. But it was obvious to me.
Do you know
obvious
Blinken?
To me. A little bit. Not well.
From the outside, it seems like Blinken is a driving force.
I doubt it.
Who do you think is?
I think this is a big, deep project of the security apparatus that goes back 30 years. I think the CIA continues to be a driving force. I don't know. National Security Council's obviously a driving force. The Pentagon's obviously a driving force. The Armed Services Committees. It's not one individual, but it's a project that is long dated and it doesn't turn. And we don't have a president that's very flexible of mind. We don't have a president that is, on top of any of this, it seems to me.
Not a nimble president.
Yeah, not nimble, not effective, not necessarily in charge, not necessarily making decisions. I don't really know. But what I do know is that it's not improv. It's a rudder that's stuck, I would say. In other words, they can't do something different. And what is improv is that the last thing they tried didn't work. So now they need to quickly improvise something else as the rudder is stuck so we continue on the same destructive path. And it's not working. So, oh my God, we've got to do something else. That's the improv part. But what is not changing is goals, direction, strategy, or this most basic point, which for me is a kind of, it sounds so simple-minded, but I actually, from a lifetime of experience, really believe in it. We don't talk to the other side.
We also seem to be huffing our own gas a bit, believing our own lies.
We believe that we need to lie because maybe if your rudder's stuck and you're the skipper, you have to say, full speed ahead. In other words, if you can't move the rudder, you have to give some self-justification for why we continue towards disaster.
So, for example, since you are an economist, the economic effects of kicking Russia out of SWIFT, et cetera,
right,
of these very serious sanctions imposed against Russia 2.5 years ago, big picture, it seems like that's a country with an economy based on natural resources and manufacturing. Ours is largely an economy based on finance, lending money and interest, and real estate.
Right.
Which is more durable? Which is more real? That's my perspective. What's your sense of it?
I think the basic point on the sanctions is if you have oil, if you don't sell it to Europe, you can sell it to Asia.
Well, yeah.
And it wasn't so hard, and they figured that out.
Even I know that, though.
They figured out how to get those tankers in. They figured out how to get insurance cover, and they figured out how to do it. And they're making a lot of money, and the sanctions didn't have any effect. And what they also didn't understand, and I think it's also important for people to understand, in all of this neocon strategizing, they had this glimmer of insight, and actually Zbig Brzezinski was very good on it. He said, by all means, the one thing never to do is to drive Russia and China together.
Well, exactly.
And he said very explicitly, and he says in 1997 in his book, The Grand Chessboard, I think it's called, he says, but this is so unlikely. This would be so crazy to do. And this is exactly what these dunderheads have done.
Who are the neocons? How would you describe them? What is a neocon?
A neocon is a group of true believers starting that really rose to force in the last years of Bush Sr. It was Cheney, Wolfowitz, Rumsfeld, but it became absolutely bipartisan. Victoria Nuland is kind of the ultimate.
Yes.
Her husband,
Bob Kagan.
Robert Kagan, is kind of the public intellectual of the neocons. I mean, he is. He's
I know Bob well. Yes. He's an idiot.
Yeah, well,
he's your public intellectual.
He's the guy that writes the tomes that
but he's
say,
a child.
I think that this has been just about the most disastrous foreign policy imaginable. How can you go from peace in 1991, when you have a chance for creating a peaceful, cooperative world that could actually be prosperous and do good things together, to this mess that we're in? It took a strategy so stupid, so reckless, so blind, and that's what the neocons gave us. They gave us a strategy which said, we now run the world. And explicitly, we will be the world's policemen. We will fight the wars that we need to fight whenever and wherever we need to fight them. We will make sure that there's never a rival. Well, you do that long enough, you end up in lots of absolutely destructive, stupid wars. And the rest of the world doesn't just sit back and say, oh, thank you, U.S., we're so grateful you're the leader. They say, come on, you're 4.1% of the world population. There's another 95.9% of the world population that actually would just like peace and some cooperation, and not you to be telling us what to do. So this strategy was explicit, clear, adopted in the last years of basically in 1991, 92, after the Soviet Union was dissolved in December 1991. Clinton is just not serious, consequent, or experienced enough. He wasn't a rigid neocon, but Madeleine Albright was a true believer, and Clinton drifted in that direction. And that's also partly something to understand, which is when you have the biggest military machine in the world, when you are so powerful, the war machine is always revving. There's always some case for war. The neocons basically said, yeah, we're the policemen, we're the constabulary. This is our duty. And said you have to be in each of these conflicts because U.S. reputation also depends on this. So they invited regional wars and everywhere and all the time, and believed, of course, we could clean out governments we didn't want, regime change by war, by covert operations, and so on. And it became not a little movement; it became the dominant drive. So Clinton kind of drifted. His administration was divided between Madeleine Albright and Holbrooke on one side and William Perry on the other side, but he went with Albright. By the end of Clinton's term was NATO enlargement, bombing of Belgrade, and we were kind of off to the races. Then came Bush Jr., 9/11, global war on terror, but basically 9/11 as the opportunity to implement the project for the new American century, which is the document that defines the neocon agenda. And it's such an interesting document because very clear, it was very carefully studied, and it's also important to understand the U.S. is a big ship, so it doesn't turn quick, so you prepare a path, or it's this stuck rudder, as I said. And you can read in Rebuilding America's Defenses, which was a kind of campaign document for the incoming Bush Jr. administration, what we should do. And it defines this neocon agenda. So Bush Jr. introduced all of these things, the unilateral withdrawal from ABM, the war in Iraq, the expansion of NATO to 7 more countries, the commitment to expand NATO to Ukraine and Georgia. Then comes Obama. You don't think of him as a neocon especially, but who becomes the point person for Eastern Europe and Ukraine, Victoria Nuland. So interesting. Victoria Nuland was the Deputy National Security Advisor of Cheney.
I remember very well.
Yes. So she was Cheney's advisor. Then she was George W.'s ambassador to NATO during the commitment to enlargement. And if Obama weren't a neocon, you would say, well, that's not someone I'm going to hire. But all of a sudden, she lands as Hillary's assistant. Now, Hillary's absolutely neocon to the core, and there's Victoria Nuland, and she goes from being Hillary's assistant to becoming Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, and becomes the point person in the overthrow of Yanukovych at the end of 2013 and early 2014. And Obama is not, he's also very inexperienced in obviously no experience at all in foreign policy, but he wasn't by nature a neocon, but the system keeps you moving unless you're a president that knows how to keep a foot on the brakes. And we haven't had many presidents like that. Eisenhower was one who knew how to put his foot on the brakes because he really understood this system. John Kennedy learned it, but only after the Bay of Pigs, and probably was killed by our government for trying to keep his foot on the brakes. And there have not been many other occasions when presidents kept their foot on the brakes. So in 2011, Obama does the absolute neocon play of saying, almost out of the blue, by the way, why don't we overthrow Bashar al-Assad, Syria's president? Well, that's a little damn weird, but suddenly you start hearing Assad must go. I was on Morning Joe when that statement by Hillary was made, and Joe Scarborough looked at me and said, "Jeff, what do you think?" And I said, well, how are they going to do that? That sounds like another pretty stupid idea. And it turned out that was 2011. We've had 13 years of war in Syria, hundreds of thousands dead.
Destroyed the country.
Of course, destroyed the country. And who's president? Bashar al-Assad. And interestingly, I can tell you, oh, God. Yeah, I can tell you. In 2012, the U.S., there were protests, there were things that were going on in Syria, but the president said, okay, we'll send in the CIA to overthrow the government in Syria. And if anyone is wondering, we do this dozens of times, so don't have any illusion that this is unusual. It is the job, the terms of reference of the CIA to overthrow governments in other countries. I don't approve. I think it leads to war, destruction. It hasn't passed Putin's notice that that's the job of the CIA, so it's another reason he doesn't exactly want the U.S. on his border and so forth. Okay, so we start arming the jihadists, I mean, crazy things in Syria. Yeah, I can say it. I'm just thinking because... and the U.S. says Assad must go. So the UN starts a diplomatic process to try to find peace, which is the job of the UN. It's not to implement U.S. regime change. It's to try to find peace. So the UN succeeds in getting all of the parties to agree to a peace agreement, except one, the U.S. So the idea that you couldn't find peace, you couldn't find all these different factions in Syria. There was an agreement reached, but there was one obstacle to the agreement, and the obstacle was the U.S. said on the first day of this agreement, Assad must go, and the response was, why don't you have it a process? There'll be in 2 years an election or 3 years. Don't overthrow the government the first day. We have all this in place. And Obama, well, I don't know if it's Obama, probably Hillary, but whatever, said no. So that's why there was no agreement.
But what was the motive? Like, why would you want to overthrow Bashar al-Assad?
Very strange. I've never heard an absolute intelligent reason for this. Believe me, their idea is, we can do it. Why not? One argument was that the neocons had a list. And this is actually what Wesley Clark, who was, NATO's supreme commander in the end of the 1990s. I know Wesley quite well, and he's also spoken about this. He said the neocons had a list that they were going to clear out in the 2000s, all of the governments aligned with the Soviet Union or with Russia. Now, Russia has a naval base on the Mediterranean.
Yes.
And so Assad is therefore an enemy. Or not an enemy. He doesn't rise to the level of being an enemy. He's someone whose peace you can take off the board and put in your own peace. That's all. So the idea is incredible arrogance. They don't think, honest to God, I don't know, whoever gave that order knew nothing about Syria. That I can guarantee you.
But the downstream effects of that were horrifying.
Well, unbelievable.
Well, created ISIS, so...
Yeah, but we probably created ISIS pretty directly because we funded jihadists all along the way. That's our story since 1979, actually.
Yes.
So this goes back a long time. They're not clever. They're not honest. They're not transparent. They are arrogant to the hilt. And they don't talk to anybody else, including to us, the American people, including to Congress, including to counterparts in other countries. And it gets you into trouble when you're so flippant and flagrant. Because remember, what was happening in Syria, they did exactly the same thing in Libya. And you look at Libya, they decided to take out Gaddafi. Why? No one really knows.
He was cooperating with us at that point.
No one knows because